Book 23 of Hannibal by Livy. 1. After the Battle of Cannae and the capture and sacking of the camps, Hannibal had wasted no time in moving from Apulia into Samnium. He had been invited into the territory of the Herpini by Statius Trebius, who undertook to deliver Compsa to him. Trebius was a Compsan who enjoyed some distinction amongst his people, but who faced harassment from the faction of the Mopsii, a family that was powerful because it enjoyed Roman support. When news came of the Battle of Cannae, and thanks to pronouncements from Trebius, word of Hannibal's coming spread abroad. The supporters of the Mopsii left town. The city was then surrendered to the Carthaginian without a fight, and a garrison was installed, leaving all his spoils and baggage here. Hannibal now divided his army and gave Mago orders to take over the cities in that area that were defecting from Rome, or to force them to defect if they refused to do so. He himself made for the Tyrrhenian Sea through Campanian territory, his intention being to attack Neapolis so that he would have a coastal city in his possession. On entering the Neapolitan territory, Hannibal positioned some of his Numidians in ambush wherever he could opportunely do so, and there are many high-banked roads and hidden recesses in the region. Others he instructed to ride up to the town gates, making a show of driving before them the animals taken as booty from the countryside. Since they appeared to be a small and poorly organized group of men, a cavalry squadron charged out against them, but this was drawn into an ambush by the calculated retreat of the Numidians and surrounded. Not one of the Neapolitans would have escaped but for the proximity of the sea, where some vessels, mostly fishing boats, were sighted not far from the shoreline, and these offered a means of escape to those who could swim. However, a number of young noblemen were captured or killed in the engagement, and these included the cavalry commander, Hegius, who fell as he pursued the retreating Numidians with too little caution. The sight of its walls dissuaded the Carthaginian from an attack on the city, for they were no easy proposition for an assault force. 2. Hannibal then veered towards Capua, which had long been basking in prosperity and the favor of fortune. Of particular significance in the general decadence, however, was the license of its common people, whose freedom knew no bounds. One Pacuvius Calavius, a nobleman who was also a supporter of the popular party, but who had gained power by disreputable means, had made the Senate of Capua submissive to himself and the commons. He happened to be occupying the most senior magistracy in Capua, the year of the defeat at Trasimene. And he believed that, because of their long-standing hatred of the Senate, if given the opportunity for a revolution, the commons would be ready to commit a monstrous crime. Should Hannibal arrive in the area with his victorious army, he thought, they would butcher the Senate and surrender Capua to the Carthaginians. Pacuvius was a rogue, but not totally unscrupulous. He preferred to wield power in a republic that was healthy rather than one brought to ruin, and at the same time he believed no republic was healthy if shorn of its deliberative council. He consequently embarked on the scheme to save the Senate and also make it subservient to himself and the commons. Pacuvius convened the Senate and, by way of introduction, stated that any plan of seceding from the Romans would find no favor with him unless it proved essential. He had children by a daughter of Appius Claudius, and had given his daughter's hand to Marcus Livius in Rome. But he continued, something much greater and more fearful was afoot. The commons did not merely intend to drive the Senate from the state by a revolt, he explained. They actually wished to murder the senators and surrender a defenseless republic to Hannibal and the Carthaginians. But, he said, he could free them from that danger if they left the matter in his hands and trusted him for getting all their political differences. Overcome with panic, the senators all agreed to leave matters to him, and Pacuvius said to them, "I'm going to lock you in the Senate House. I shall pretend to go along with the plot they are hatching, and in endorsing plans it would in any case be useless for me to oppose. I shall find a way to rescue you. You can have any pledge you wish on this." Pacuvius gave the pledge, went out, and ordered the Senate House to be locked. He left a guard at the entrance, so that no one could enter or leave the building without his order. 3. He then summoned the commons to a meeting. "People of Capua," he said, "you now have what you have often wished for, the power to punish an unconscionable and despicable Senate. And you have it without danger and freely given to you, with no need for violent attacks at enormous risk to yourselves on individuals' homes that are defended by troops of clients and slaves. Take them now. They are all locked in the Senate House, along and unarmed. But take no haste or random and ill-considered action. I shall give you the authority to decide the fate of every one of them, so they can all receive the punishment they deserve. But in gratifying your resentment, you must above all see that your own safety and self-interest come before your anger. For in my opinion, if it is these particular senators that you hate, you do not wish to have no Senate whatsoever. Indeed, you must choose between having a king, God forbid, or a Senate, the one deliberative body in a free state. Accordingly, you have to do two things at the same time. You must dissolve the old Senate and also select a new one. I shall have the senators summoned one by one, and I shall consult you on what their fate is to be. Whatever action you decide on will be put into effect, but before the guilty party is punished, you must select as his replacement a brave and dynamic new senator. Pacuvius then took his seat. The names of the senators were placed in an urn, and he gave orders for the first name drawn to be read out, and for that person to be brought from the Senate House. When the name was heard, everyone cried out that the man was a rogue and a scoundrel, and that he deserved to be executed. "I see what your judgment is on this man," Pacuvius then observed. "So give me an honest and fair-minded senator in place of this rogue and scoundrel." At first There was silence. They could find no one better to suggest. Then one man overcame his bashfulness and gave some name or other. The clamor that immediately went up was much louder, some saying they did not know the man, and others uttering derogatory remarks on his disreputable conduct, or his lack of breeding, his shabby poverty, and his degrading trade or means of livelihood. The reaction was all the more boisterous with the summoning of the second and third senator, making it abundantly clear that while the Commons had no time for the individual in question, they had no one to put in his place, and in fact nominating the same people over again served no purpose, since nomination had merely exposed them to verbal abuse, and any remaining candidates were much more lowly and obscure than those who first came to mind. As a result, men slipped away, proclaiming that the devil one knows best is the easiest to tolerate, and calling for the senator's release from custody. 4. In this way, by the gift of life to its members, Pacuvius made the Senate subservient, and more so to himself than to the Commons, and be now held supreme power. And he now held supreme power, without the need of weapons, since everybody deferred to him. After this, the senators gave no thought to their position or their independence. They fawned on the Commons, greeted them in passing, gave them cordial invitations, and hosted sumptuous meals for them. They took on their lawsuits, and always appeared as advocates for the side, or voted as jurymen for the case that was closer to the people and more likely to win favor with the crowd. In fact, all business in the Senate was now conducted just as if it were an assembly of the Commons that was being held there. Capua was always a city-state inclined on hedonism. This arose not merely from a flaw in the national character, but also because the town afforded an unstinting supply of entertainment, as well as all the exquisite delights that come from land and sea. And at that particular time, too, the cacophony of the nobles and the license of the Commons led to such profligacy that lust and extravagance knew no bounds. There was disrespect for the laws, the magistrates, and the Senate, and to this was now added, following the defeat at Cannae, disdain for the power of Rome, for which there used to be some respect. One thing alone held the Capuans back from immediate secession. The time-honored right of intermarriage had connected many of their distinguished and powerful families with Roman families. In addition, while a considerable number of Capuans served amongst the Romans, a particularly strong link existed in the 300 cavalrymen, companions of the best families, who had been handpicked and sent by the Romans for garrison duty in the Sicilian city-states. 5. It was the parents and kinsmen of these men who with some difficulty won assent for delegates to be sent to the Roman consul. The delegates found the consul at Venusia with a few poorly armed men before the departure of Canusium. He cut a figure that was as poignant as could be for allies who were loyal, but one that would generate only contempt in those who, like the Capuans, were arrogant and untrustworthy. In fact, by his excessive openness and candor in discussing the defeat, the consul only increased their disdain for him and his plight. The delegates reported to him the distress of the Capuan Senate and people over any misfortune suffered by the Romans, and undertook to supply all the assistance they might require for the war. Men of Campania, Varro replied, in telling me to ask of you what we need for the war, you have maintained the usual form of discourse with allies instead of adopting a manner of address appropriate to our current fortunes. For what do we have left at Cannae to justify our asking allies to make up what we lack, which presupposes that we actually possess something? Are we to levy infantry from you as though we still have cavalry? Are we to tell you we are lacking in cash as if that is all we lack? Fortune has left us absolutely nothing, and we can even supplement. Legions, cavalry, weapons, standards, horses, men, cash, supplies, all perished either on the battlefield or in the loss of the two camps the following day. And so, men of Campania, it is not so much a question of your having to help us in the war as of your practically fighting the war for us. Think of the time when your ancestors were driven panic-stricken within their fortifications, and it was not just the Samnite enemy they dreaded, but the Sidicinian as well. Remember how we took them under our protection and defended them at Setacula, and how a war with the Samnites, which we started for your sake, we fought for almost a century with mixed success. Consider these points too. When you capitulated, we gave you a peace treaty on fair terms, and allowed you your legal system. And finally, a very great concession, at least until the defeat at Cannae. We have most of you Roman citizenship, sharing our state with you. We gave most of you your Roman citizenship, sharing our state with you. And so, men of Campania, you should consider that you have a share in this defeat that has been sustained, and should think that you ought to protect the fatherland that we share. Our fight is not with Samnite or Etruscan, which would at least mean that power wrested from us would still remain in Italy. This is a Carthaginian enemy, not even native to Africa, and he brings from the farthest limits of the earth, from the waters of the ocean and the pillars of Hercules, soldiers who have no knowledge of human law and civilization, and one can almost say of human language. These men are bloodthirsty and brutish in their nature and customs, and their leader has further brutalized them by building bridges and dikes from piles of human bodies, and one shudders even at the mention, by teaching them to feed on human flesh. It would be a crime even to touch such abominable banquets, but to look upon and have as masters men who have fed on them, to have laws imposed from Africa and Carthage to permit Italy to be a Numidian and Moorish province. One only needs to be born in Italy to find this abhorrent. It will be a noble achievement, men of Campania, if the power that was prostrated by the defeat of the Romans should prove to have been sustained and revived by your loyalty and your resources. 30,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry can, I think, be raised from Campania, and you have cash and grain to spare. If you have as much loyalty as you have material assets, then Hannibal will not feel that he has won a victory, and no more will the Romans feel that they are defeated. 6. Following these words from the consul, the delegates were discharged. As they made their way home, one of their number, Vibius Virius, remarked that the time had arrived when the Campanians could not merely recover the land of which they had once been unjustly divested by the Romans, and also gain supreme power in Italy. They would now make a treaty with Hannibal on any terms they wished, he said, and there was no question but that the Campanians would be left with sway over Italy once Hannibal finished off the war, retired in triumph to Africa, and took his army off with him. Varius's words won the approval of all his colleagues, who so framed the report on their mission as to make everyone think the Roman name had been wiped out. The immediate result was that the commons of Capua and most of the Senate began to consider abandoning Rome, but matters were delayed for a few days thanks to the influence of the older senators. Eventually, the majority opinion won the day. The same delegates that had gone to the Roman consul were to be sent to Hannibal. I find in some sources the statement that before these men went to Hannibal and the plan to defect became a reality, a deputation was sent to Rome by the Campanians, demanding that, as a condition for their assisting the Roman cause, one of the two consuls should be Campanian. There was an angry outburst. The order was given for the delegates to be removed from the Senate House, and a lictor was sent to take them from the city and command them to be out of Roman territory that day. A demand once made by the Latins is too similar for coincidence, and Coelius and other authors have understandably omitted the episode. I therefore feel apprehensive about recording it as a fact. 7. The envoys came to Hannibal and negotiated a peace treaty with him on the following terms. No Carthaginian general or magistrate was to have authority over a Capuan citizen, and a Capuan citizen was not to perform any military or other service against his will. Capua was to have its own legal system and its own magistrates. The Carthaginian commander was to give 300 of his Roman prisoners of war to the Campanians. The Campanians themselves were too close these, and used them to effect an exchange for the Campanian cavalry serving in Sicily. Such were the terms, and in addition to the pact that they made, the people of Capua also committed some atrocities. There were prefects of the Allies and other Roman citizens in Capua, some in official military capacity and others involved in private business affairs. The commons suddenly arrested all of these, and on the pretext of keeping them under guard, had them locked in the baths, so they would die a horrible death by asphyxiation in the searing heat. Vigorous opposition to such acts, as well as to the sending of the delegation to the Carthaginian, had been voiced by Decius Magius. He was a man who lacked none of the attributes for achieving the highest position, apart from having compatriots in their right mind. Hearing that a garrison was being dispatched to Capua by Hannibal, Decius first of all openly and loudly protested against admitting it, and he cited the examples of fierce, high-handed despotism, and the wretched subjugation of the people of Tarentum. Then, when the garrison was admitted, he declared that it should be driven out. Alternatively, he said if the people of Capua wished to perform some bold and memorable act to redeem themselves for the terrible crime of abandoning their oldest allies and their kinsmen, they should murder the Punic garrison and return to their allegiance to Rome. These recommendations were not made in secret, and, when they were reported to Hannibal, he first of all sent people to summon Magius to him in his camp. Magius, in no uncertain terms, refused to go. Hannibal had no authority over a Campanian citizen, he said, whereupon the Carthaginian, beside himself with anger, ordered the man to be seized and dragged before him in irons. He then became afraid that the use of force might precipitate some disturbance, and that there might be some unwise confrontation if passion flared. He therefore sent a message to the Capuan praetor Marius Blosius, saying that he would be in Capua the following day. He then set off from camp with a small escort. Marius convened a popular assembly at which he told the people to go in a crowd, along with their wives and children, to meet Hannibal. His instruction was carried out by the whole population, not only without demur, but with enthusiasm, for the proletariat supported Hannibal, and were eager to see the general now famous for so many victories. Decius Magius did not go forth to meet him, nor yet did he keep out of the public eye, for that might suggest some fear on his part arising from a guilty conscience. He took a leisurely stroll in the Forum with his son and a few of his clients, while the entire community was agog at the prospect of welcoming and setting eyes on the Carthaginian. Entering the city, Hannibal immediately demanded an audience with the Senate. The most prominent companions then begged him not to conduct any serious business on the day, and to celebrate with joy and a light heart the day his arrival had made into a holiday. Hannibal was irascible by temperament, but he wanted to avoid saying no to anything right at the outset. He therefore spent most of the day touring the city. 8. Hannibal stayed at the home of the two Ninaei Celeres, Stenius and Pacuvius' men, distinguished for their breeding and wealth. To this house Pacuvius Calavius brought his young son. Calavius, mentioned above, was the leader of the party that had mustered support for the Carthaginians. He had dragged the boy from the side of Decius Magius, with whom he had been fervently championing the Roman alliance against the pact with Carthage. Deterred neither by the fact that his city-state sympathies leaned the other way, nor by deference to his father. For this young man, the father at that time gained Hannibal's indulgence, more by entreaties than by offering justification for his behavior. In fact, overwhelmed by the father's tearful pleas, Hannibal even had the boy invited to dinner along with his father, and this was a gathering at which he would be entertaining no Campanian apart from his host and a distinguished soldier by Bellius Torreia. They began dining in daylight, and the banquet had nothing in keeping with Carthaginian mores or military discipline. On the contrary, it suited the wealth and extravagance of the city-state, and indeed of the house, and included all manner of titillating delights. Only one person could not be induced to take a drink, despite invitations to do so from the host or occasionally from Hannibal himself, and this was Calavius the son. He himself pleaded an illness, and his father preferred the excuse of an emotional upset, which was quite plausible. Towards sunset, the elder Calavius left the dinner party, followed by his son. When they reached the seclusion of a garden to the rear of the building, the son spoke. "Father," he said, "I have a plan that will do more than secure us pardon from the Romans for the wrong we did in going over to Hannibal. It will also give us Campanians much greater standing and favor with them than ever before." The father, taken aback, asked what the plan could be. The boy threw back his toga from his shoulder, revealing a sword strapped to his side. "I am now going to ratify our treaty with Rome by shedding Hannibal's blood," he said. "I wanted you to know about it ahead of time, in case you preferred to be absent while the deed is done." 9. When the old man saw the weapon and heard his words, it was as if he were already witnessing the coup of which he was being told, and he was frightened out of his wits. "Son," he said, "I beg and beseech you, in the name of all the rights that bind children to their parents, do not follow through before your father's eyes on this totally unspeakable scenario, and yourself suffer its consequences. Only a few hours have elapsed since we took a solemn oath, swearing by all that was holy, and joining our right hands with Hannibal's. What for? So that we would leave our conversation with him and immediately put weapons to use against him into the hands bound by that oath? Can you rise from your host's table, to which only you and 2 other companions were Hannibal's invitees, to stain that very table with the blood of your hosts? I was able to gain Hannibal's indulgence for my son. Can I not gain my son's for Hannibal? But forget about what is sacred. Forget about trust, religion, duty. Dare to do your unspeakable acts, as long as they do not destroy us, as well as making us criminals. Are you going to attack Hannibal as a deserter, then a visitor? He would like to live nowhere more than in the kingdom of the men whom he now regarded as the champion and guarantor of his liberty, he said. 11. In the course of these events, Quintus Fabius Pictor returned to Rome from his mission to Delphi, and read out the text of the oracular response. This listed the gods and goddesses for whom propitiatory rites were to be held and procedure involved. The document continued. If you follow these instructions, men of Rome, your circumstances will improve and become easier. The future of your republic will be more according to your wishes, and victory in the war will go to the Roman people. When your republic's success and safety are won, see that you send to Pythian Apollo a gift from the gains you shall have made, and that you do him honor with the plunder, booty, and spoils. Guard against gloating over your success. After he had read this out, translated from the Greek verse, Pictor added that, on emerging from the oracle, he had immediately used offerings of incense and wine to sacrifice to all the deities specified. Also, he had worn a laurel wreath, both coming to the temple and while performing the sacrifice there, and he had been told by the temple priest also to wear it to board ship, and not to remove it before reaching Rome. He had been very particular and precise in carrying out all the instructions he had been given, he said, and he had set the wreath on the altar of Apollo in Rome. The Senate decreed that all sacrifices and propitiation... excuse me. The Senate decreed that all sacrifices and propitiatory... oh my God. Propitiatory. Propitiatory rights. That's my best bet. That had been indicated should be carefully performed at the earliest possible opportunity. Property. Propitiatory. Oh my God. What is wrong with my mouth today? Propitiatory. Fuck it. During the course of these events in Rome and Italy, news of the victory at Cannae had reached Carthage, thanks to Mago, son of Hamilcar. Mago had been sent by his brother, though not directly from the field of battle. He had been held back a number of days enlisting the Bruttian and, in brackets, nothing, communities that were abandoning their allegiance to Rome. Granted an audience with the Senate, Mago recounted his brother's exploits in Italy. Hannibal had met 6 commanders on the battlefield. He said 4 of them consuls, and the 2 others a dictator and a master of horse, and with them 6 consular armies. And he had killed upwards of 200,000 of the enemy, and taken more than 50,000 prisoners. On the 4 consuls, he had killed 2. One of the remaining 2 was wounded, and the other had fled with barely 50 men after losing his entire army. The master of horse, a position as powerful as that of consul, had been defeated and put to flight, while the dictator was hailed as a peerless general because he had never committed himself to battle. The Brutii, the Apulians, and a number of the Samnites and Lucanians had defected to the Carthaginians, and Capua had surrendered to Hannibal. Capua, the capital, not just of Campania, but, after the drubbing the Romans had received at the Battle of Cannae, of Italy too. For these victories, so great and numerous, Mago concluded the immortal gods should be truly thanked. 12. At that point, to prove how successful the campaign had been, Mago ordered gold rings to be poured out at the entrance of the Senate house. The mound they formed was so great that, according to some sources, they amounted to more than 3 measures, though the story that has prevailed, and this is closer to the truth, is that it was no more than 1 measure. Mago then added a commentary to make the defeat look even greater. Only knights wore this status symbol, he said, and of knights only the most distinguished. The nub of his address was that the closer Hannibal came to realizing his hope of finishing the war, the more he should be assisted in every way. The campaign was being fought a long way from home, in the midst of the country of the enemy, he said. Grain and cash was being used up in large quantities, and all those pitched battles, while they had indeed wiped out so many enemy armies, had also involved some attrition to the victors' forces. Accordingly, Mago concluded they should send reinforcements, and they should also send grain and money for their pay to the soldiers who had served the Carthaginian people so well. After these comments from Mago, everyone was overjoyed, and Himilco, a member of the Barca faction, thought he had a chance to taunt Hanno. "Well, Hanno," he said, "are you still sorry that the war was started with the Romans? Order the surrender of Hannibal now, and tell us not to offer thanks to the immortal gods when things go so well. Let us listen to a Roman senator in the Senate house of Carthage." "I would normally have remained silent today, members of the Senate," replied Hanno, "so as not to make you hear what you would consider less happy words in the midst of such universal rejoicing. But now a senator asks me if I am still sorry that the war was started with the Romans. Remaining silent would make me appear either supercilious or a lickspittle, a man in the first case oblivious to others' independence, or the second oblivious to his own. My reply to Himilco would be that I have not stopped regretting the war, and that I shall not stop criticizing your invincible general until I see the war brought to an end on terms that are at least acceptable, and nothing other than a new peace will end my longing for the old peace." Those boastful remarks that Mago made a moment ago are pleasing to Himilco and the rest of Hannibal's partisans. They are possibly pleasing to me, too, because military successes will give us a more favorable peace if we are prepared to follow up our good fortune. This is an opportune moment at which we can be seen to be offering peace terms rather than being offered them. Let it slip, and I fear that the jubilation of ours may be overindulgent and prove illusory. But just what is this jubilation all about anyway? I have wiped out armies, enemy armies. Send me soldiers. How would your request be different if you had suffered defeat? I captured 2 enemy camps, which were, of course, full of spoils and supplies. Give me grain and cash. What else would you be asking for if your own camp had been seized and taken from you? But, so that I not be alone in marveling at all this, I should like to get some answers either from Himilco, which is only fair and right since I have answered him, or from Mago. First, since the battle at Cannae has meant the annihilation of Roman power, and since it is an established fact that all of Italy is up in arms, has any people from the Latin League gone over to us? And secondly, has any individual from the 35 Roman tribes deserted to Hannibal? When Mago answered no to both questions, Hanno continued. So, in fact, as far as enemies are concerned, we still have all too many of them. But those large enemy numbers, I should like to know what their morale is, what hopes they still have. 13. When Mago said he did not know, Hanno retorted, no knowledge is easier to come by. Have the Romans sent Hannibal ambassadors to sue for peace? Have you in fact received any report of peace being talked about in Rome? When Mago's reply was once more in the negative, Hanno said, so we have a war in which we are no further forward than the day Hannibal crossed into Italy. There are a large number of us still alive who remember how victory shifted back and forth in the earlier Punic War. Prior to the consulship of Gaius Lutatius and Aulus Postumius, we seemed successful as never before in land and sea operations. But when Lutatius and Postumius were consuls, we were defeated off the Agates Islands. Suppose that on this occasion, to God forbid such a thought, fortune should shift. When we go down in defeat, do you expect peace terms such as no one offers now when we are winning? I do have an opinion to express if anyone raises the question of offering peace terms to the enemy or accepting them from him. But if it is a matter of Mago's request that you are raising, I do not think it serves any purpose to send assistance to a force that is already victorious, and much less will I vote for sending it to men who are hoodwinking us with false and groundless hopes. Hanno's address impressed few of his hearers. His vendetta with the Barca family diminished his credibility, and hearts filled with the joy of the moment refused to listen to anything that might test the validity of their satisfaction. A little more effort, they thought, and the war would soon be won. Accordingly, by a huge majority, a senatorial decree was passed that authorized the sending of 4,000 Numidians to reinforce Hannibal, and with them 40 elephants and, there's a missing part in the writing here in brackets, a number, I suppose, talents of silver. And a dictator was also sent to Spain with Mago to raise a mercenary force of 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry as reinforcements for the armies in Italy and Spain. 14. However, these resolutions were put into effect in a slow and casual manner, a common phenomenon in times of success, but Roman procrastination was ruled out by their circumstances, to say nothing of the inbred energy of the people. The consul was found wanting in no sphere for which he was responsible. The dictator, Marcus Junius Pera, completed the religious ceremonies, and then made the usual proposal to the people that he be authorized to mount a horse. He already had the 2 city legions that had been mobilized by the consuls at the start of the year, the slave conscripts, and the cohorts gathered from the countryside of Picenum and Gaul. But he now descended to the last resort of a state that was almost desperate, when honor yields to practicality. He issued an edict that would order the cancellation of the penalty or the debts of men who had been condemned and imprisoned for a capital offense or debt, if they would serve in his army. In this way he recruited 6,000 men, whom he armed with Gallic spoils that had been carried in Gaius Flaminius's triumph. He then left the city with 25,000 soldiers. After taking possession of Capua, Hannibal alternated promises and threats in a second attempt to win the support of the Neapolitans, and when this failed, he led his army across into the territory of Nola. He did not immediately strike a threatening pose, as he was not without hope of a voluntary surrender, but he was ready to spare its people no suffering or terror if they frustrated his expectations. The town senate, and especially its most important members, was solidly for the alliance with Rome. However, the commons, as usual, were all for change, and all in favor of Hannibal. They also feared the devastation of their farmlands, and envisioned the many serious and shocking ordeals to be faced in a siege. And men to instigate a revolt were not in short supply. Gripped by a fear that if they proceeded openly, the proletariat would rise up and be impossible to resist, the senators found a way of postponing the evil moment by pretending to go along with their wishes. They pretended that they favored defection to Hannibal, but that there was little agreement amongst them on the terms for transfer to the new treaty and new alliance. In this way, they gained a breathing space, and they quickly dispatched delegates to the Roman praetor Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who was at Castellinum with his army, and informed him of the parlous situation in Nola. Their farmlands were in the hands of Hannibal and the Carthaginians, they said, as the city would be in no help if no help were sent. They explained that it was only by agreeing with the commons to defect at any time the commons chose that the Senate had succeeded in heading off a nasty defection. Marcellus complimented the Nolan representatives. He told them that that same pretense should be continued to drag matters out until his arrival, and that meanwhile their dealings with him and any prospect of Roman assistance should remain a secret. Marcellus himself headed for Caiatia from Castellinum. After that he crossed the river Volturnus, and, making his way through the territory of Saticola and Trebia, reached Nola by a route through the mountains above Susula. With the Roman praetor's arrival, the Carthaginian left the territory of Nola and came down to the coast near Neapolis, for he wanted to occupy a coastal town that would afford his ships a safe crossing from Africa. He then learned that Neapolis was in the hands of a Roman prefect. This was Junius Silanus, who had been called in by the inhabitants of Neapolis, and so he headed for Nuceria, bypassing Neapolis as he had done Nola. He blockaded Nuceria for some time, making numerous assaults on it, as well as numerous unsuccessful overtures to the commons on some occasions and to the leading citizens on others, but eventually starved it into submission. The terms of surrender he dictated were that the inhabitants could leave unarmed and with one item of clothing per person. From the start, Hannibal had wished to be seen as a compassionate to all Italians except the Romans, and he now offered rewards and important positions to any of the people of Nuceria who would remain in the town and were prepared to serve with him. Not even with promises like that did he get any to stay. The Nucerians all slipped away to various companion cities, particularly Nola and Neapolis, wherever offers of accommodation or impulse took them. Some 30 senators, and as it happened, all the leading members made for Capua, but were refused entry for having shut their gates on Hannibal. They then went to Cumae. The spoils of Nuceria were given to the Carthaginian rank and file, and the city was sacked and put to the torch. At Nola, Marcellus's hold on the town rested more on the favor of the leading citizens than any confidence he had in his garrison. The commons were a source of anxiety for him, and a certain Lucius Bantius more than anyone. Bantius's guilt over the attempted defection and his fear of the Roman praetor were inciting him to betray his native city, or, in the event of fortune failing him, to desert to the enemy. He was an energetic young man, and at that time close to being the most famous knight amongst the allies. Found half dead amidst a heap of corpses at Cannae, he had been kindly treated by Hannibal, who had even sent him home with gifts. Feeling gratitude for Hannibal's kindness, Bantius had wanted to put the state of Nola under the authority and control of the Carthaginian, and the praetor could see that he was tense and restless in his desire for change. He had either to be subdued by punishment or else appeased by kindness, and Marcellus preferred to enlist for himself an ally who was strong and full of energy, rather than simply take an ally from the country. He therefore had him summoned and addressed him with kind words. There were many amongst Bantius' compatriots who were jealous of him, said Marcellus. This was easily deduced, he explained, from the fact that no citizen of Nola had made any mention of him, of Bantius's many outstanding military exploits, and yet his courage could not be a secret to anyone who had served in a Roman camp. Many who had campaigned with Bantius would tell him about the sort of man this Nolan was, and about the dangers he had often faced to preserve the security and honor of the Roman people. And they would talk of how at the battle of Cannae, Bantius did not quit the field until the point when, well nigh exhausted, he was buried under the men, horses, and arms that came crushing down on him. So, my compliments to you on your courage, continued Marcellus. In my camp every kind of honor and reward will be yours, and the more time you spend with me, the more you will find that quality of yours redounding to your prestige and your advantage. The young man was pleased with the Roman's assurances. Marcellus then presented him with a superb horse, and instructed his quaestor to pay him 500 denarii. He also told his lictors to grant Bantius access to him whenever he wished to see him. The truculent young man's temper was so softened by this considerate approach on Marcellus' part that from that point on no ally served the Roman cause with greater courage and loyalty. Hannibal was again at the gates, having once more moved camp from Nuceria to Nola, and the Nolan masses were for a second time contemplating changing sides. On the enemy's arrival, Marcellus withdrew within the walls, not because he feared for his camp, but simply in order not to give an opportunity of betraying the city to the and all too many people who were seeking one. The battle lines then began to form up on both sides, the Romans before the walls of Nola and the Carthaginians in front of their camp. Some minor skirmishes ensued in the space between the city and the camp, with varying outcomes. The commanders were unwilling to check the few men who recklessly charged the foe, but they were also unwilling to give the signal for a full-scale engagement. During this daily standoff between the two armies, leading Nolan city citizens reported to Marcellus that nightly discussions were taking place between the commons and the Carthaginians. At these, they said, a decision had been taken to plunder the Romans' equipment and baggage when their battle line had marched out of the gates. The insurgents would then shut the gates, seize the walls, and when they were masters of the situation and of the city, they would let in the Carthaginians in place of the Romans. When Marcellus was advised of this, he commended the Nolan senators and decided to risk a battle before there could be any trouble within the city. He marshaled his army in 3 divisions at each of the 3 gates facing the enemy, and he gave orders for the baggage to follow behind and for the attendants, camp followers, and invalids to carry palisade stakes. At the center gate he positioned his strongest legionary troops and the Roman cavalry, and at the 2 side gates he placed the new recruits, the light infantry, and allied cavalry. The people of Nola were forbidden to approach the walls and the gates, and the troops designated as reserves were assigned to the baggage to prevent an attack being made on it while the legions were engaged in the battle. Formed up in this way, the Romans now stood within the gates. Following his practice of the previous few days, Hannibal spent a large portion of the day in battle formation. He was initially surprised that the Roman army did not emerge from the gate, and also that there was not a single armed man on the walls. He then assumed that the secret discussions had been divulged to the Romans, and that it was fear that kept them inactive. He therefore sent a number of his men back to camp with orders to bring up to the front line at the double all the equipment needed for an assault on the town. He was quite sure that if he put pressure on the Romans while they wavered, the masses would start some disturbance within the town. While all were feverishly scurrying to the front ranks to take up their various duties, and as the battle line was approaching the walls, the gate suddenly swung open. Marcellus gave the order to sound the attack and raise the battle cry, and commanded first the infantry and then the cavalry to charge out at the enemy as hard as they could. When these had already caused much panic and commotion in the Carthaginian center, the legates Publius Valerius, Flaccus, and Gaius Aurelius burst out against the enemy flanks from the 2 side gates. The uproar was increased to shouts from the camp followers, attendants, and numerous other men assigned to guarding the baggage, and the result was that the Carthaginians, who had nothing but contempt for their foes, inferior numbers, suddenly had the impression of a mighty army before them. I would not presume, as some authors do, to put the number of enemy dead at 2,800, with the loss of no more than 500 Romans. However, Whether the victory was as decisive as that, or whether it was smaller, the achievement of the day was enormous, and possibly the greatest of the war, for it was more difficult to avoid defeat by Hannibal at that time than it was to defeat him later on. 17. Cheated of his hope of taking Nola, Hannibal fell back on Echori. Marcellus immediately shut the gates and posted guards to prevent anyone from leaving, and then, in the Forum, publicly interrogated the men who had engaged in the secret talks with the enemy. Upwards of 70 people were found guilty of treason. Marcellus had them beheaded, and declared their belongings the common property of the Roman people. Government of the state was put in the hands of the Senate. Marcellus then set off with the entire army and took up a position above Suessula, where he established a camp. The Carthaginians at first tried to coax Echori into voluntary surrender, but then, when they saw the people were intransigent, they prepared for a blockade and an assault on the town. In fact, the people of Echori had more determination than strength. Losing hope of defending their city, and seeing their walls being ringed with siege works, they slipped out in the still of the night before the enemy could complete the circumvallation, passing through gaps in the enemy breastworks and the neglected sentry posts. Then, taking roads or traveling cross-country, and either following a planned route or drifting aimlessly, they made good their escape to towns of Campania that they were sure had not switched allegiance. Hannibal sacked Echori and put it to the torch. Then, when he was brought a report that the Roman dictator and his new legions were being summoned to Casilinum, he led his army to that town, fearful that there might also be some insurgency at Capua, with the enemy camp in such close proximity. At the time, Casilinum was occupied by 500 men from Praeneste, along with a few Romans and Latin allies. News of the defeat at Cannae having brought them to the same spot. The mobilization at Praeneste had not been completed on schedule, and these men of Praeneste had thus been somewhat late in leaving home, so that they had reached Casilinum before there was any word of the defeat. Others, Romans and allies, had joined them there, and they had set out together from Casilinum in quite a large column, when a report of the battle of Cannae brought them back to the town. They remained there for a number of days, eyed with suspicion by the companions, whom they themselves feared, and they spent the time guarding against sedition and in turn fomenting it. On receiving reliable information that negotiations were under way for Capua's defection, and that Hannibal was being welcomed in the city, they massacred the town's population at night, and seized the part of the city north of the Vulturnus, a river that cuts the town in two. These were the men who comprised the Roman military presence in Casilinum, and that was augmented by a cohort from Perusia, 460 men who had been driven to Casilinum by the same report that had brought the men of Praeneste a few days earlier. It was a sufficiently large armed force to defend walls of such limited compass, which also received cover from the river on one of its two sides. In fact, the shortages of grain made even this group of men seem inordinately large. (18) When Hannibal was already not far from the town, he sent a party of Gaetulians ahead under an officer named Iselca. He told Iselca to begin with consolatory words should he be granted the opportunity to parley, and to try to coax those inside to open the gates and admit a garrison. If they remained defiant, Iselca was to use force and try to break into the city wherever he could. When the Gaetulians approached the walls, the silence suggested that they were deserted. Approached the walls, the silence suggested that they were deserted. The barbarians assumed the Romans had been frightened into withdrawal, and so they prepared to force the gates and smash the bolts. Suddenly, the gates opened and two cohorts, formed up inside expressly for the purpose, burst forth with a deafening clamor and wreaked havoc on the enemy. The first wave repulsed in this way. Hannibal was sent in with a stronger force. But he too could not stem the counterattack from the cohorts. Finally, Hannibal encamped right before the city walls and prepared to storm this little town and its little garrison with an all-out assault and using all of his troops. While he pressed ahead and attacked the enemy, completely surrounding the walls with a ring of troops, he lost a number of men, including his best fighters, to missiles from the walls and turrets. On one occasion, when the enemy took the initiative with a sortie, Hannibal almost cut them off from the town by setting a column of elephants in their way. He then drove them in panic into the town with comparatively heavy losses. Given their numerical weakness, there would have been further casualties had night not broken off the battle. The following day, the hearts of the Carthaginians were fired up for the attack, especially when the prospect of a golden wall-scaling crown was set before them, and after the commander himself delivered some sharp words. These conquerors of Saguntum were mounting a lackluster assault on a small fortress on level ground, he said, and he reminded them, one and all, of Cannae, Trasimene, and Trebia. Then they began moving up the mantlets and making tunnels, and the Roman allies did not lack energy or ingenuity in countering the various designs of the enemy. They set up protective devices against the mantlets, used intercepting ditches to head off the enemy tunnels, and took countermeasures against all their operations, whether open or covert, until eventually humiliation made Hannibal drop his enterprise. He fortified his camp, established a small garrison, to avoid the impression of abandoning the campaign, and withdrew to winter quarters in Capua. In Capua, Hannibal kept his army in housing for most of the winter. It was a force that many ordeals over a long period had hardened to face all life's discomforts, but which had no experience of or exposure to its good things. The result was that men whom the most intense misery had failed to break were now ruined by excessive comfort and unlimited pleasure, and the more thoroughly ruined because, thanks to their inexperience, they had immersed themselves in them all the more eagerly. Sleep, drink, dinner parties, whores, baths, and inactivity that, from habit, became sweeter every day. All this sapped their physical and moral strength, so much so, in fact, that their protection now came from past victories rather than their current strength, and this came to be regarded by military scientists as a greater blunder on the leader's part than his failure to march on Rome straight from the Battle of Cannae. For Hannibal's hesitation on that occasion could have been seen as merely postponing the victory. But this mistake could be seen as having deprived him of the strength needed to win, and so indeed, when he left Capua, it was as if he were at the head of another army. No trace remained of its former discipline. Large numbers came back from the city embroiled in relationships with prostitutes, and as soon as they were bivouacked in tents and were faced with marching and other military chores, their lack of strength and morale was like that of a raw recruit. Then, throughout the summer season, most began to slip away from the standards without leave, and the deserters' hiding place was always Capua. 19. As the winter began to lose its harshness, Hannibal led his men from winter quarters and returned to Casilinum. Though the assault had been suspended, the ongoing blockade and had nevertheless brought the townspeople and its garrison to the depths of deprivation. The Roman camp in the area was under the command of Tiberius Sempronius, the dictator having left for Rome to retake the auspices. Marcellus also wanted to bring assistance to the beleaguered townspeople, but he was detained by the flooding of the river Volturnus, and also by the entreaties of the townspeople of Nola and Achurai, who feared what the Campanians might do if the Roman garrison departed. As for the Gracchus, he merely stuck close to Casilinum without making any move, for he was under orders from the dictator to take no initiative during his absence. And yet the news coming from Casilinum Casilinum was such as would easily try anyone's patience. There were reports of people having hurled themselves from the walls because they could no longer bear the hunger, and of others standing on them unarmed, offering their unprotected bodies to the missiles that were hurled at them. Gracchus was deeply distressed at this situation. He dared not open hostilities without the dictator's authorization, and yet he could see that a fight was necessary for him to bring wheat into the town in the open, and there was no hope of bringing it in unobserved. His solution was to fill several jars with grain that he brought together from all the surrounding farmland, and then send a message to the magistrates in Casilinum, telling them to fish out any jars the river brought down. The following night, the attention of all was focused on the river, with hopes raised by the message from the Romans, and the jars, which had been released midstream, came floating down to them. The grain was then doled out in equal shares amongst the entire population. This was repeated the next day, and the day after that, the containers being released, and also reaching their destination at night, had so escaping the notice of the enemy sentinels. But then, thanks to an unbroken period of rain, the river began to flow faster than usual, and it drove the jars in a cross-current toward a section of the bank patrolled by the enemy. There they became caught up in some willows growing from the banks, and were spotted. A report was brought to Hannibal, and after that greater care was taken to prevent anything being sent unobserved down the Volturnus to the city. Even so, some nuts that were thrown from the Roman camp did float down to Casilinum midstream, and were fished out with wicker baskets. Eventually, those inside faced such extreme privation that they tried chewing straps and leather stripped from shields, softening it in boiling water. They did not stop short of eating mice and other creatures either, and they pulled up all kinds of grass and roots from the banks at the base of the city wall. When the enemy had plowed up all the patches of grass outside the wall, the defenders planted turnip seeds, prompting Hannibal to exclaim, "Am I going to sit before Casilinum until they begin to sprout?" And the man who before that had refused to hear any talk of negotiations now finally agreed to discuss the ransoming of freemen in the town. A price of 7 ounces of gold per person was settled upon, and when they were given Hannibal's solemn assurance on this, the people of Casilinum surrendered. They were kept in irons until the gold was paid in full, and then they were released just as promised. The version of events is more credible than the other, that the released men were murdered by horsemen sent to attack them as they left. Most of them were men of Praeneste. Of the 570 members of the garrison, fewer than half lost their lives to the sword of starvation, and the rest returned unharmed to Praeneste with their praetor Marcus Anicius, a former clerk. Proof of this lay in the statue of Anicius that was set up in the forum of Praeneste. He wears a cuirass and a toga, and his head covered, and there is an inscription on a bronze plate stating that Marcus Anicius had fulfilled his vow for the soldiers who served in the garrison at Casilinum. An identical inscription was placed beneath the 3 statues set up in the Temple of Fortune. 20. The town of Casilinum was restored to the Campanians, and it was furnished with a garrison of 700 soldiers from Hannibal's army to prevent a Roman attack when the Carthaginians left. The Roman Senate passed a decree granting the Praenestine soldiers double pay and a 5-year immunity from military service. They were granted Roman citizenship in recognition of their valor, but declined to make the change. The record is less clear on a lot of the men from Perusia. No light is shed on it by any movement of Perusians set up themselves, or by any Roman decree. Amongst the Brutii, only the people of Petelia had remained loyal to the Roman treaty, and at this time they came under attack not only from the Carthaginians who controlled the region, but also because of their difference in policy from the rest of Brutii. Unequal to the difficulties facing them, the Petelians sent an embassy to Rome to ask for military assistance. When they were told they must fend for themselves, the ambassadors burst into tearful protestations in the vestibule of the Senate House, and their entreaties and weeping moved the Senate and common people to profound sympathy. The matter was therefore raised for a second time with the senators by the praetor Marcus Aemilius. The senators took stock of all the reserves of the empire and were forced to admit that they had not the resources to assist allies so far removed. They told the Petelians to go home and, when they had taken their loyalty to the limit, to look after their fortune, well-being as circumstances directed. When the outcome of the mission was reported to the people of Petelia, deep melancholy and dread instantly gripped their senate. A number advocated that they all flee as best they could and abandon the city. Others were for joining the rest of the Brutii and using them as intermediaries to surrender to Hannibal, now that they had been deserted by their traditional allies. The view that prevailed, however, was that of the men who voted that they should take no hasty or foolhardy action, and that they should consider the matter afresh. The issue was raised again the following day, when there was less hysteria, and the most distinguished members successfully upheld their view that they should bring all produce in from the fields and strengthening the city and its walls. 21. At about this same time, letters were brought to Rome from Sicilia and Sardinia. Both islands. Sicily and Sardinia. The one from Sicily, from Titus Ottacilius, was the first to be read out to the Senate, and it recounted that the praetor Publius Furius had come to Lilybaeum from Africa with his fleet, but that he had been seriously wounded and his life was hanging by a thread. Soldiers and crews were not being given their pay or grain rations on time, said Ottacilius, and there were no resources to make this possible. He was therefore strongly urging that these items be dispatched at the earliest opportunity, and also, if the senators agreed, that they send out one of the new praetors to succeed him. Much the same message concerning pay and grain was contained in the letter from the propraetor Aulus Cornelius Mamula in Sardinia. The answer given to both men was that there were no resources available, and they were to take personal responsibility for provisions for their fleets and armies. Titus Ottacilius then sent a delegation to Hiero, a man without peer in his support of the Roman people, and from him received all the money he needed for his men's pay, plus 6 months' supply of grain. In Cornelius's case in Sardinia, the allied city-states contributed generously to support him. In Rome, the financial crisis also led to the appointment, on a proposal from the plebeian tribune Marcus Minucius, of a triumvirate of treasury officials. These were the former consul and censor Lucius Aemilius Pappus, Marcus Atilius Regulus, former consul on 2 occasions, and Lucius Scribonius Libo, currently a plebeian tribune. Marcus and Gaius Atilius were elected triumvirs, and these dedicated the temple of Concord that Lucius Manlius had promised in a vow during his praetorship. 3 pontiffs were also elected: Quintus Caecilius Metellus, Quintus Fabius Maximus, and Quintus Fulvius Flaccus. These replaced respectively Publius Scantinus, who had died, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the consul, and Quintus Aelius Paetus, both of whom had fallen in battle at Cannae. 22. Having now filled, as far as human resourcefulness could, all the gaps left by the unbroken string of disasters, the senators finally took account of themselves, specifically of the empty Senate House, and the paucity of their numbers when meeting to decide public policy. In fact, there had been no revision of the Senate since the censorship of Lucius Aemilius and Gaius Flaminius, despite the fact that, in the intervening 5 years, so many senators had been carried off by the defeats as well as by individual misfortunes. The dictator had finally left the city to join his army after the loss of Casilinum, and it was the praetor Marcus Aemilius who, in response to a general demand, raised the matter in the House. Spurius Carvilius thereupon delivered a long speech deploring not merely the dearth of senators, but the shortage of citizens from whom members could be selected for the Senate. He then declared that he strongly urged the granting of citizenship to 2 senators of each of the Latin peoples, these to be chosen by the members of the Roman Senate. From this pool, he said, men could be selected for the Senate to replace deceased members. The proposal, he explained, was aimed at bringing the number of the Senate up to quota, and also at forging closer ties between the Latin and Roman peoples. The senators' reaction to this proposal was no more favorable than when the Latins themselves had earlier made the same request. There was a buzz of indignation all through the House, and Titus Manlius, in particular, observed that there still lived a descendant of the family of that consul who had once, on the Capitol, threatened to kill with his own hands any Latin he saw in the Senate House. At this juncture, Quintus Fabius Maximus declared that no subject had ever been raised in the Senate at a more inappropriate time than this one. The allies' feelings were unpredictable and their loyalty uncertain, he said, and a comment like that could only unsettle them even more. This foolhardy remark, coming from a single individual, he continued, should be suppressed by everybody else's silence. If there ever was anything of an intimate or sacred nature that needed to be kept secret in the House, then this was certainly it. Something to be covered over, concealed, forgotten, and regarded as unsaid. And so it was that all mention of the proposal was stifled. It was decided that a dictator should be appointed for recruiting members to the Senate. He was to be a man who had already been a censor, and was the oldest of all ex-censors still alive, and the Senate ordered that the consul Gaius Terentius be summoned to make the appointment. Terentius returned to Rome from Apulia by forced marches, leaving a military presence in place, and made the appointment the following night, as was customary. In accordance with a senatorial decree, he appointed Marcus Fabius Buteo dictator for 6 months, without a master of horse. 23. Fabius climbed the rostra with his lictors. He did not approve of the unprecedented situation of there being 2 dictators in office at the one time, he said, and he disapproved of his being a dictator without a master of horse. He likewise disapproved of the censor's power being granted to a single individual, and to one who had already held it at that, and of a 6-month imperium being granted to a dictator unless he had been appointed to conduct military operations. This irregular situation, he continued, was the result of chance, the times, and the exigencies of their situation, but he was going to circumscribe it. He would not remove from the Senate any of the appointees Gaius Flaminius and Lucius Aemilius had as censors selected for the House. He would merely have their names written down and read out. In this way, the reputation and character of the senators would not be subject to the judgment and ruling of a single individual. Moreover, he would replace deceased members in such a way as to let it be seen that preference was given to one rank over another, not to one man over another. After reading out the names of the members of the old Senate, Fabius began by replacing deceased members with men who had been curule offices after the censorship of Lucius Aemilius and Gaius Flaminius, who had not yet been selected for the Senate, and he prioritized them on the basis of who had been elected first. He then chose former aediles, plebeian tribunes, or quaestors, and after these, men who had not gained magistracies, but who had spoils from the enemy affixed to their houses, or who had been awarded the civic crown. In this way, 177 members were inducted into the Senate, and with great approval. Fabius then immediately resigned his office, and, telling his lictors to leave, came down from the rostra in private as a private citizen. He joined the crowds who were occupied with their own private business, deliberately frittering away the time so as not to draw people from the forum to escort him home. Even with that interlude, men's support for him did not flag, and he had a large entourage escorting him to his home. The consul returned to his army the following night, but did not inform the Senate for fear of being detained in the city to oversee the elections. 24. The following day, on a motion from the praetor Marcus Pomponius, the Senate decided that the dictator should be sent written instructions to come to Rome, if he deemed it in the public interest to oversee the consular elections, bringing with him his master of horse and the praetor Marcus Marcellus. The senators could then learn directly from these men how matters stood for the state, after which they could formulate policy as the situation required. All three individuals summoned did appear, leaving subordinates in command of their legions. The dictator spoke briefly and in modest terms about himself, but passed most of the credit on to his master of horse, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He announced the date for the elections, and at these the consuls elected were Lucius Postumius, elected for the third time, and in absentia, since his fear of responsibility at the time was Gaul, and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who was then master of horse and curule aedile. Then the praetors were elected: Marcus Valerius Lavinus for a second time, Appius Claudius Pulcher, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, and Quintus Mucius Scaevola. After the election of the magistrates, the dictator returned to his army in its winter quarters at Teanum. He left in Rome the master of horse who was going to assume office in a matter of days, and could discuss with the senators the enlistment and mobilization of troops for the coming year. Just at the point when these proceedings were underway, news came of a fresh setback, as fortune piled one disaster on another that year. The consul designate, Lucius Postumius, and his army had been wiped out in Gaul. Postumius was going to lead his army through a huge wood called Litana by the Gauls. To the right and left of the road that went through the forest, the Gauls cut the trees in such a way that, with no pressure on them, they would remain standing, but if given a slight push, they would topple over. Postumius had under his command 2 Roman legions, and he had mobilized a contingent of allies from the Adriatic coast, so large that he was leading 25,000 troops into enemy territory. The Gauls had surrendered the forest perimeter, and when the Roman column entered the woods, they pushed at some of the outer trees that they had severed. These fell one on another, each of them unsteady itself and barely keeping upright, and crashing down on both sides of the road, crushed weapons, men, and horses. The result was that barely 10 men made good their escape. Most were killed by the tree trunks and broken branches, and the Gauls, who waited in arms all around the woodland area, dispatched the remainder, panic-stricken as they were after this unforeseen calamity. From such a large number, few prisoners were taken. These were men who headed for the bridge over the river, only to find themselves cut off since the bridge had already been seized by the enemy. Postumius fell at the battle site as he fought with all his might to avoid capture. The jubilant Boi carried the spoils from the general's body and his severed head to what is their most sacred temple. Then, as is their custom, they scraped out the head and overlaid the skull with gold, and this served them as a holy vessel for the pouring of libations at religious ceremonies, and also as a drinking cup for the high priest and the temple overseers. Indeed, for the Gauls, the spoils were no less important than the victory. It is true that most of the animals were crushed in the collapse of the trees, but everything else was found all along the path of the devastated column, since there had been no flight to disperse it. 25. Such was the alarm in Rome for several days following the report of the defeat that shops remained closed, and a hush like that of the dead of night descended on the city. The Senate, therefore, assigned the aediles the task of patrolling the town and issuing orders for shops to be opened and the atmosphere of public gloom dispelled. Tiberius Sempronius then called a meeting of the Senate. There he consoled the senators, and, to encourage them, said that men who had refused to give up after the disaster at Cannae should not lose heart in the face of lesser setbacks. In the case of the war with the Carthaginian foes and Hannibal, he said he simply prayed that things would go as he hoped. The Gallic war could be shelved and left in abeyance, and it would be for the gods and the people of Rome to avenge later the treachery of the Gauls. What they had to consider and discuss now was the Carthaginian foe, and the armies to be used for the campaign against him. Sempronius himself first briefed them on the numbers of infantry and cavalry, and of citizens and allies, in the dictator's army, and then Marcellus enumerated the troops under his command. Intelligence on forces with the consul Gaius Terentius of Apulia was sought from informed individuals, but no way could be found of forming two consular armies strong enough to cope with such an extensive theater of war, and so, prodded though they were by righteous indignation, they decided that Gaul be shelved for that year. The dictator's army was now allotted to the consul. With regard to the army of Marcus Marcellus, it was decided that those soldiers who had been part of the flight from Cannae should be shipped over to Sicily to serve there for as long as the war lasted in Italy. All the weaker soldiers in the dictator's legions were also to be removed to this destination, but with no period of service defined apart from their regular terms. The two city legions were allocated to the other consul, who would be replacing Lucius Postumius, and he was to be elected as soon as possible, account being taken by the auguries. It was further decided that 2 legions should be brought from Sicily at the earliest opportunity. From these, the consul, who was assigned the urban legions, was to take all the men he needed. The consul Gaius Terentius would have his imperium extended for a year, and there would be no cuts made to the army he was commanding for the defense of Apulia.